Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Latino Vote podcast, where you come for the accents, but you stay for the screenshots. Now, today, Mike Madrid, and I'm telling you in advance, we're going to nerd out today because we've got posters and numbers and all the things. This will probably be the only time today you'll actually get to hear me do any talking, because we've got some special guests, lots of polls, lots of Latino vote information. Mike, how has your week been, big author?
The weekend's was really good, but like you said, I am interested and excited about today because it's a little bit like Latino Nerd Fest here on the Latino Vote podcast, where we're going to geek out a little bit on some of the numbers and just kind of get a sense of where the trajectory of all of this is going, because there are so many questions. So without further ado, I'm gonna jump right into the guest, because you and I can get caught up offline, Chuck. We talk all the time.
Sure.
But I do want our guests to know that our guests today, our in studio guests today, is somebody whose work I have looked at and revered, and I consider the absolute gold standard of Latino voter public opinion. His name is Mark Hugo Lopez. For those of you that know Mark, you know how good he is. For those of you that don't, you're in for a real treat, and you are familiar with his work, even if you're not familiar with his name. For 16 years, he has been at Pew Hispanic Research, where he was the director of the entire research center there on the Hispanic vote. That has broadened as the country has as the country has grown more complex and more diverse, and there is more deep diving into the different ethnicities and races that are comprising the quilt and fabric of America. How was that, Chuck?
Great.
Like that.
I like when you use quilt.
Yeah, quilt and fabric of America. I'm going to put that in there. We cajoled Mark into visiting with us today because we want to talk about the trajectory and the dynamics of this race, what he's seen in the past, what's different in methodologies and testing, if anything, what is new, what is old. And Mark, I just couldn't be more excited to have you today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Happy to be here. Thank you, Mike, for the wonderful introduction. And Chuck, it's great to see you. Great to talk with you both. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because there's lots to talk about.
Go ahead, Mike. I'm not even going to act like I'm going to ask the first question. Just jump right in there.
So I'm like chomping at the bit like a racehorse trying to get out of the gate. Let's just start at the 30,000 foot level, Mark. I mean, you guys put out which is new, I think, for Pew, which is a little bit of a head-to-head contest, and looking as we're heading into the general election, a long 7 months away, long ways out, lots is going to happen. But when I saw this come out, I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is new. Pew is now looking at the horse race here, meaning Biden versus Trump, essentially, and testing third-party candidates. Talk to us a little bit about, one, why Pew decided to do that, and then two, what you found, and then segue that into Latino voters and what you guys see happening there.
Yeah, so as you noted, the Pew Research Center so far in this election cycle has not done a head-to-head survey question, or what we might call the horse race question. That's because it's a little bit early. In fact, it's still early to really be trying to predict what's going to happen in November. In many ways, the election hasn't quite taken off yet, because come September, I think is when we'll start to see that. But it's been kind of quiet because the primaries were all decided early. And so is the public paying a lot of attention? Well, our survey finds that half of U.S. registered voters are giving the election a lot of thought, but the other half are not. So is it too early to start doing horse races? Well, maybe, but we needed to understand who are Biden supporters and who are Trump supporters. So part of the reason to ask this question now is to get a sense of what those two groups' views are of the candidates, of the election, and so much more. Now, what did we find? Well, we found that the race is very close. About 48% of U.S. registered voters say they would vote for Joe Biden today. About 49% say Trump. In other words, it's a statistically dead heat. For Latino voters, what we found, so this is Latino registered voters, and this was a survey done in mid-April. Among Latino registered voters, 52% said that they would vote for Joe Biden if the election were held today. 44% said that they would vote for Donald Trump if the election were held today. That is, in many ways, what you've seen many other survey researchers find. You've seen that with polls from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, something very, very similar. And so our first take on the horse race for Latino registered voters is one that is in many ways in the ballpark of others, but also reflects a shift that's happened over the years. So that's where things currently stand.
Now look at, go ahead, Chuck. You're on mute.
Mike, let me jump in here before you get all crazy and start asking questions that regular people won't understand. What I really want to know, Mark, is that Mike is big to point out normally my flaws of data and history, because I don't know much about any of them, but that's exactly what I want to ask about, which is, you've done this for a long time. You've seen the patterns. I believe some polling I don't believe. But I think polling over time is showing you something for sure. And I think you would agree with that. And we've heard about the shift to the right or the shift to the left. When you said 44, it reminded me that Latinos had been at 44% before with a guy named George Bush after the election was over. But then it also makes me think that Latinos were down to 28 or 30, maybe under Barack Obama or under Hillary Clinton. And I've seen this vote moving up and down in these national surveys. But that's the question, is over time, as you've seen these George Bush bumps or the other way bump for Barack Obama in the 2008 election that was historic, these characters who drive these things like Donald Trump is now, what's the thing that's really stood out to you as looking at this data over time?
That's a great question, and it really is that we have in some ways been here before. So I think we need to talk about the characteristics of each election. They're very distinct. George Bush is a very different candidate than Donald Trump, particularly in his appeal to Hispanic voters at the time, because he'd been governor of Texas and had also been somebody who had been an advocate for immigration reform, also for bilingual education. So in some ways, he's very different than Donald Trump.
Let me jump in. He also had really great consultants, by the way.
He didn't have very good consultants at all, but Mark, please go on. Sorry you were interrupted.
No worries. But I would add that if you look back even further, go all the way back to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, according to exit polls, and there's we can have a conversation about the quality of exit polls generally when it comes to Hispanic voters. But back then, Ronald Reagan won about 35% of Latino voters' support in 84, for example. So this has kind of been, as you noted, an up and down. In Barack Obama's years, you would see Republican candidates win maybe 22 to 25%. So those are kind of lows in terms of Republican presidential level support among Latino voters. So yes, we've had these ups and downs. I think candidates really matter. The positions of candidates can matter, but also the circumstances of the country and the world can play a big role here in how and where Latino voters end up landing with regards to particular candidates. I think it's also interesting, though, that Latino voters in some ways move more than other voters do, and perhaps more than people usually think about when they think about Latino voters. And that's one of the striking things in the last few years for me, is the growing attention to what's happening with Latino voters.
Mark, thanks for that. And I want to thank both of you for kind of passively aggressively pointing out just how competent, capable, and exceptional the Latino consultants working for George W. Bush were to set those historically high numbers. Let me also say,
Jesus Christ. Oh, sorry. I thought I was on mute.
Let me also point out, and I think this is important, the Latino electorate was very different in 2000 and 2004 than what we're talking about 20 years later. It was much more recently migrated. There was a much more significant Spanish dominant section and portion of the Latino voter. And in many ways, when we were doing those campaigns, there was a higher hill to climb. And I point that out only because while it is absolutely true, this vote is bouncing back and forth and bouncing around, I think it's also important to point out that just demographically, we're looking at a very different electorate. And the future, none of us know what the future looks like, but we do know, I think, that it's going to be a somewhat different trajectory than we have in the past. It is exceptional to be saying that, to have Pew come out this early saying the numbers at this moment in time have a Republican candidate, especially one like Donald Trump, testing at 44%. What I want to talk about, what I want to ask and pick your brain about is, It's not uncommon for early polling to show Latinos kind of reflecting more conservative opinions than actually show up on election day. There's almost this like week of the election, things break back and go into a historical range. And you'll see, Latinos kind of supporting the Republican back in a mid 30s range. So my question is, one, how is that? Do you have any understanding or reflections or insight into why that might be? One, two, because we are seeing so many public polls showing Latino voters in essentially the same range as you're showing them in, is it best to look at polling as directional? In other words, something is changing, or trying to actually tune into the actual numbers and say, this is where voters are at 44%. And I ask that because an old warhorse like me is kind of going, even in George Bush's day, we weren't seeing polls 7 months before the election showing us at 44%.
It's a really great question. I would say the following, and I think our survey that we released recently has some insights on this point. I wonder to what extent Latino registered voters in surveys like ours and others are registering their dissatisfaction with the current president. So is there support for Donald Trump and their support for Biden in these horse race questions at this point about presidential approval or dissatisfaction with the direction of the country, more so than saying, with who they're going to actually vote for when the election comes around. Now, I will say that there's something that's really interesting in this particular set of results, which is that we found about half of Latino registered voters told us that they'd like to see both candidates changed on the ballot, which is in line with the general U.S. public in a lot of ways, but it suggests something that perhaps there's dissatisfaction with both candidates. And then when it comes to approval of Joe Biden, we have been finding that Latinos generally disapprove of the job he's doing. Our most recent numbers show 32% approve of Biden's job performance, but 2/3 disapprove of the job he's doing as president. Not much change in the last few months, but that's way down from a reversal from at the start of his presidency, when 71% of Latinos in 2021 approved of the job Biden was doing at the time. So it's a big change. Another piece of information: Biden's favorability among Latinos has declined more sharply than it has among any other racial or ethnic group. From 22 to 2024, we've seen, for example, majority of Latinos having a favorable view back in 2022, but today only 37% have a favorable view of Biden.
That's from the midterms.
From the midterms, from 2022 to 2024. That change is the sharpest decline among any large racial or ethnic group. So I think the story is one of where these horse race questions may be capturing dissatisfaction with the president's performance, and they could change as we get closer and people actually start to focus on the election and we see more campaign ads and there's more outreach from campaigns. We'll see what happens, but I have a feeling that may be a part of the story.
And do you see the same kind of dissatisfaction? Obviously, you probably don't see the movement, but do you see the same when you talk about Donald Trump? Are Latinos saying they're excited about him?
That's interesting. So we had actually asked whether or not Latinos thought that Donald Trump was a good president or a great president. And we found that 32% of Latino adults, 34% of Latino registered voters said he was a good or great president. What about Biden? 20% of Latino adults today tell us that Biden is a good or great president. So more Latinos see Trump as a good or great president than Biden, but notice that it's not a majority. In fact, you'll find that the majority of Latinos feel that both Trump and Biden weren't really great presidents. So there's, I think, though, a little bit of a story there that is important to keep in mind, is that the assessment of Trump is a little bit better in retrospect than it is of Biden today.
I think it's important to ask this question so people know, let's use your words, Chuck, that people know who you was talking to. So this is a national survey of folks all across America. Can you tell us how many people you talked to?
Yeah, so this was a survey of over 10,000 U.S. adults. It is a survey that includes a sample of almost 2,000 Latinos, because Latinos make up such a large part of the nation's population. And so this is a nationally representative sample. It is done online, but it is a panel that we ourselves have built through address-based sampling. What that means is we randomly found people around the country with invitations by mail and have invited them to be a part of our panel. It's not an opt-in panel like you see for some others, and we are the only ones who use this panel to conduct our survey. So we aren't selling space on it to other folks. I think that's an important distinction here to keep in mind, that it's just for Pew Research. So our respondents, our participants, know that it is only Pew Research who's going to reach out to them once a month or so. And that's the panel that we have built. It's called the America Trends Panel.
Before Mike jumps in, let me one little quick follow-up. Do you have enough data to have states broken out in this thing?
It's not designed to tell us about the states. Yes,
Cool.
I think this is the one
Yeah.
challenge of surveys like ours. National, yes, but of course, this election will be decided at the state level, which is why those state polls are important, but they also can have challenges too.
That is an extraordinary number of interviewees, especially
10,000. That's a lot, right, Mike?
Yeah, that I know for a guy like you.
10,000. That's like how much money I got in my bank account for my whole life.
Pesos. Yeah, we're talking dollars.
Pesos,
You're talking
dollars.
pesos.
My bad.
So look, this is why I consider Pew to be the gold standard. Again, this panel that they built is designed specifically with all the big brands at Pew to gauge sentiment. It is their own panel. It's proprietary. They built it themselves. They're not just calling a vendor and having them send a file over, and purchasing it for a few bucks. This is something that they have internally built over the years, and it's extraordinarily impressive. And it's why the accuracy of this thing is really quite remarkable. I'm hoping, Mark, you can explore a little bit more about what you see as the rationale. And you guys are a nonprofit, incidentally. You're not a partisan firm, which is also why I love using you guys, especially when you guys put out something that I have not seen, or back when I was doing a lot more partisan work, didn't agree with. I would always be like, what is Mark finding that I'm missing? What is he seeing that I have missed? And so it's a great check for good political consultants. But what do you chalk up that level of dissatisfaction to, and why is it distinct amongst Latinos as opposed to other large racial or ethnic groups?
I think it may be a similar pattern, by the way. Phenomena might be happening among Black voters, because our same survey showed that 18% of Black voters would support Donald Trump if the election were held today. And I think you're seeing it among other voters too. But at least for the Black and Latino stories, this phenomena of registering dissatisfaction is being captured, I think, in the horse race question to some extent. But why? Part of it is the issues that the Latino voters point to as important priorities for the country to address. So in January, we had asked about this and had a whole list of 20 different issues. Economy, inflation particularly, were really the top issues, just like it is, by the way, for the general public. That's one of, I think, the big stories here, is that for Latinos, oftentimes the same issues end up being mirrored in the general public that Latinos point to as important issues for either their vote or for the country to address. Immigration was much farther down, but we also find that there is dissatisfaction with what's happening at the border. So that same survey from January asked a whole host of questions about what to do and what should be the priorities for U.S. immigration policy. And while Latinos are not quite to the same degree in support of expanding a border wall or deporting those who are unauthorized immigrants living in the country or undocumented immigrants, there is dissatisfaction with the way things are being handled at the border. And oftentimes Latinos are nearly as negative about things and the government's job performance as the U.S. public. Like 3/4 of Latino adults say the government is doing a bad job with what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. There are other issues too. We've seen abortion rise as an issue of interest among Latinos in recent years, and that may end up being something that's important in this election. We'll see where things go. But really, it's economy and inflation and the challenges of pocketbook issues that Latinos are pointing to in our surveys.
In this survey that I'm sorry, Mike.
Chuck keeps saying I ain't going to ask any questions. Then he's filibustering the whole damn interview here.
Gosh damn it. I want to get in here so much.
I know. So I will ask one other question. I'll hand it back to Chuck. We have seen Latinos in Pew Research increasingly say, or at least generationally, the further they are removed from the immigrant experience, identify that they feel, quote, just like typical Americans, or less and less as an identify or distinct ethnic or racial group. How much of what we're seeing is Latinos becoming less of a racial ethnic voting bloc and more of an economic and or class voter? And is that changing over the years?
That's a really good question. I do think that you talked about earlier the changing composition of who are Latino voters. And just in the last 20 years, for example, the number who are eligible to vote, who are at least adult U.S. citizens, has doubled since 2000.
Yeah.
But what's also changed is a lot of the growth has come from Latinos born here in the U.S. who've come of age. On the order of about 1 million or so, 800,000 to 1 million a year who were born in the U.S. become adults. And so over the course of 4 years between presidential elections, you have at least 3 million plus new potential Latino voters who are young people. And you add in those who naturalized, it's another almost million. So you get about 4 million more Latinos who are eligible to vote each cycle. You can imagine how quickly that's changing the composition of the group. Identity still matters because these are people who self-identify as part of the Latino population. So they still see themselves as Hispanic or Latino or Latinx. They still see themselves as part of this group. We do find that oftentimes Latinos say that what happens to the Latinos is important for their own experiences, particularly during the 2020, 2021 conversation around race that happened in the country. So I think that there is a strong still Hispanic identity, but it is changing because many of these young people perhaps have a non-Hispanic parent. Many of these young people, while they may identify as Hispanic, or even by their origin group, they're more likely to say they're American and they're English speaking, not Spanish speaking. And some of our more recent survey work shows that many Latinos, particularly US born Latinos, prefer to get their news in English and are doing so online. All that is to say that this is a different group than it was just 20 years ago. Are they economy voters? I think just like all Americans, economic issues impact them too. So I wouldn't say that that's the only thing that they are, but I don't think that we can just characterize them as a group that's concerned just about one issue, whether that's immigration or something else. It is a group that has many different issues that reflect the general challenges of the country. Also, I would say the other big change since 2000 is the spread or the dispersion of the population across the country. Every major metropolitan area, every major city in the U.S. now has a Latino presence. I think that that's very important to note because, as I like to say, there are Mexican restaurants in every corner of the country. I don't know if you know this, Mike, but 10% of all restaurants in the U.S. are Mexican restaurants.
Oh, wow.
That really tells you something about where the population has dispersed to, but also that Latino culture has become part of American culture in some ways. That's another conversation.
And we just have really good food.
Really good food. But it's again an indication of how much this group has changed. So when we talk about the issues facing the Latino voters across the country, I think it's really a national story in many ways, but it also varies so much from place to place. And as you know, South Florida is not South Texas, which is not New York City, and which is not Southern California nor Nevada. We could go on and on.
Yeah.
Finally, I could say something. Hey, can you, Mark, answer me a question about, did folks act differently in the way that they answered English versus Spanish?
In our survey, you mean like in terms of the...
Yeah. Like is Trump or Biden more popular in Spanish than English or something like that?
I think he's more popular in English than he is in Spanish, at least in our
Biden or Trump? Biden or Trump?
Trump. Now, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but in looking at things like, for example, educational attainment, you'll see that Latinos who have a bachelor's degree or any college experience are more likely to say they support Trump than Latinos who have less than a high school or less education. That oftentimes is very closely related to immigrants, whether or not you're an immigrant or not. So I want to go look to see what people who did our survey in Spanish versus those who did it in English and what their preferences are. But it's a really great question. I do think you're going to see that the English speakers are more likely to be Donald Trump supporters than Spanish speakers, but that it's not going to be a huge gap, but that there will be a gap.
Go ahead, Mike.
Where is this all going? I mean, and again, are Latinos becoming more like Americans, or Americans becoming more like Latinos? Or is that the wrong way to put it? Is what is happening unique in American history, Mark? Or is it a typical assimilative pattern that we saw 100 years ago at Ellis Island?
This is another really great question. One of my good friends, researchers, used to tease me that every time we'd release a report for Pew Research, he'd say to me, "Mark, you've proved yourself out of existence yet again," because we would show that in many ways Latinos are like other Americans. I do think there's two big trends that are happening. The first is intermarriage. I think intermarriage is going to reshape the identity of this group looking forward. I don't know where that's going to go. It could be a strength. It could be something that people really lean into. It could be something that people say, I'm not connected to that Hispanic background, so I really don't want to identify as such. I don't know. We'll see where things go. The other big trend, though, that I think is of importance here is, as we think about the nation's Latino population, it is becoming more third generation. That's the fastest growing group. Now, what's third generation? These are people who are U.S. born to U.S. born parents. So they're farther away from the immigrant experience. And this, despite the recent increase in the number of immigrants coming from Latin America. Among Mexican Americans, for example, the third generation is the fastest growing group now. And that kind of echoes the 1950s and 60s before the wave of immigration that came after 1965. I do wonder if we're going back to the past in some ways for Latinos in that respect. But the country is very different today than it was back in the mid 20th century. And I don't know how a generation and identity might play out into the future. I find many Americans want to embrace all their backgrounds, not just one. And so that is a change from the past. So we'll have to see where we go. But those are two important trends: intermarriage and the rise of the third generation.
As you talk about this, I was thinking about as somebody who is that third generation. I was born in Texas. My daddy was born in Texas. My grandfather came over as a baby. Like, we've been in Texas a long time. And I was thinking about like that group of people. Me and Mike talk about how Latinos now are the new blue collar middle class, trying to get into the middle class group of folks. And because of the growth that you described, they're becoming more of the true persuadable universe of folks who are trying to figure out who is best going to be with them. But I want to talk about candidates. And I think that a lot of this, from what I see, is candidate driven from just a pure political perspective. Some of it is just pure growth. I get that. But where I see campaigns that actually compete for the information to voters, you see voters act differently no matter what the color of their skin is. And when there's no money spent in Texas, California, or New York in any big way to talk to where the majority of the Latinos live, you just get Latinos that are getting information off of Facebook or off of Fox News or MSNBC either, and they act like they can act because nobody's talking to them. The question, and that's the big Mike Madrid wind-up is what we call it on this show. The question that was made to say something really important, then think of a question that would just kind of go along with it. And that is, does candidates over the history of doing this, have you seen the spike for a Barack Obama and then see another spike for a Donald Trump? And then when you don't have those spikes, things have historically kind of stayed even on a 70-30, 60-40 between the party split over time. Am I reading that right?
Yes, Chuck, I think you are reading it right. And I think that this is an important point, something that I think reflects where there are opportunities to perhaps win more support from Latino voters. That is, people respond to attention. And while we haven't done a survey like this in a while, in the past, we've done surveys asking Latinos if they've been hearing from the candidates. Latinos don't hear from the candidates in the same way they hear that other voters do. That's one. The other thing I think it's interesting is if somebody's not reaching out to you, if you don't feel like you're part of this, you may not turn out to vote. And of course, as you know, Latinos generally turn out to vote at lower rates than other groups of Americans. That's been true even in these high turnout elections in recent years. Is it because Latinos don't care? I don't know. It may be because they're in places where they just aren't getting attention from candidates. And that may be an important part of the story. But I think you've hit on something here, which is that you do see these spikes. You do see these shifts and changes depending on what we know about the outreach from candidates to Latinos, whether it's a specific candidate like Barack Obama, or if it's somebody like Donald Trump in South Florida in 2016. These are all things that may be playing a role in the level of support candidates win. Makes sense. If you ask somebody to vote, they may turn out to vote for you.
Mark, talk to us briefly about the gender gap, if you would. How are Latinas, how the women in our community are voting differently than men? I think it's a fascinating and unexplored area.
So in our recent survey, so in the source-based question from April, we found that 47% of Hispanic men registered voters support Trump, 51% Biden. Among women, it's 41% Trump and 52% Biden, but notably 6% with other candidates or not decided yet. So there is a difference. However, we haven't seen that big of a difference over the years with our validated voter studies. In other words, going and finding out how our panelists actually did vote and looking to see how that's changed over time. There have been shifts for both Hispanic men and Hispanic women more towards Republican candidates in presidentials and midterms since 2016. But men have moved a little bit more than women overall, though more recently women seem to move more than men, but it's kind of just catching up.
And when you're saying others, how is RFK Jr. doing?
I don't know. That's actually a really good question. We asked about, would you support, who would you vote for today? Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or some other candidate?
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As we're getting here close to the end of this thing, I would like to hear we talk a lot about polls. Mike mainly talks about polls. I talk about hunting and fishing a lot on the show. But when we talk about polls, what is the advice that a lot of our people are nerds like all of us who like campaigns, and everybody every day's got some Latino survey. Latinos are at 25%. They're at 45%. There's this thing. There's Latinos are moving. Latinos are sexy right now. And I'm not just talking about me. And what I'm getting at is, what would you have people look at? What is a good Latino poll? When you look at a poll, you're like, oh, this is good. This is some good information. Or when it's like, I'm not sure if I can gain much from this. What would you have nerds be looking for in a poll, trying to get sentiment on Latino horse races or issues that would say is a good or a bad example of the right way to sample a Latino poll?
Great question. First, nationally representative. So it needs to be nationally representative of Latinos, and we're talking about a national poll. Number two, you need to have a sufficient sample size of Latinos in these polls, and that would be, it depends on the poll and how it's conducted, but it could be anywhere from, say, 150 to 300 interviews with Latinos. If you have just 20 interviews with Latinos and you're reporting that number, I wouldn't put a lot of weight in that, because it has technically a large margin of error. We can't really tell if it's a really big number or a really small number. So the sample size will matter a lot. And then the presence of Spanish in the survey. While most Latino registered voters are English speakers, about a quarter prefer to do surveys in Spanish. So what share of respondents who are Latino completed the survey in Spanish? That's important. It's actually one of the places, by the way, where a lot of pollsters have struggled, because it is hard to get Spanish speakers, even Pew Research Center. Sometimes we, in some years, have had more challenges than others. I think we've gotten to the point where I feel very comfortable with where we are, but we've at times had to supplement our Hispanic samples in order to be able to make sure that they do represent the broad diversity of the population.
Mark, I want to thank you for your time. And I want to thank you, more importantly, for your work over the years. I can't underscore enough how somebody like me has looked to your work and your research and your guidance, and that of the Pew Center, specifically the Pew Hispanic Research Center, when it was Pew Hispanic. Like when that came out, I was marching up and down the street going, this is going to be an amazing period in our people's history, the country's history. As you know, I've got a new book coming out, The Latino Century. I think I hope you'll pick it up. And I say that only because you could have probably written 2 or 3 chapters. So much of this is Pew Research's cited work. Again, I think it's the gold standard. And I really appreciate you being with us today, offering your insight and telling the story of the Latino community as it unfolds and it changes. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we'll be having you on at least one more time if you're willing as we get closer to the elections in November.
Yeah, and Mark, I want to jump in and give you closing words as well, but also say I really appreciate it. I cut up a lot on this podcast because that's my role, but I've, had lots of fun talking to you offline. You've always respected the work that I've done mutually with you and what Mike's done. I need you to catch my book that's coming out for you. It's called The Mexican Redneck Weekend. So that's what you can check from me. We're going to be talking about things that we do out in the country.
It's a coloring book. It's great. You got to pick it up.
It is, right. But I just want to appreciate you. And Mark, I want to give you the last words before I take us out.
Well, thank you both. It's a real pleasure to be on the show. I've long been a fan of the show. And also, I now have 2 books I got to go buy on Amazon right now. So I'm going to go put in my orders right now. I'm really excited to read both of them. Mike, your book looks to be really, really interesting. And Chuck, thank you for the heads up. I will go take a look at it and see. I used to have a pickup truck. Does that matter?
It does. It makes you right there. We'll put you in the club. And I appreciate you being on. And for all of you out there, I was just joking. I'm not writing any more books during an election. If I do, maybe it's called. Everybody knows that my next book's going to be called Show Up on Time, Be Nice, and Chew with Your Mouth Closed. This is the Latino Vote Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Share with your friends. Share with your families. Like us. Give us a review on the Apple Podcast, on the Amazons, and on all the other places where you can review. And until next week, me and Mike Madrid will see you later.